Welcome to Almost Here, Round the Corner Future Technology podcasts with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies poised to transform our lives for better or worse are the focus of this podcast. Almost here means these technologies are now here and starting to be used, or just around the corner, from Bitcoin to artificial intelligence, 3D printing, blockchain, virtual reality, and more.
Hi, this is Richard Jacobs with Future Tech Podcast, and my guest today is Radia Perlman. And as we discussed previously before I started the recording, Radia has a lot of credentials. She's been around working with blockchain essentially for a long time. So instead of me giving a skewed or possibly not best light introduction, I'm going to let her do it. So Radia, thank you for coming. How you doing?
Oh, fine.
Yeah. So if you would, for listeners, before we get into the topic, would you give them a little bit about your background and what you do and who you are?
Okay. Well, I have been designing network protocols for a long time. So I've done spanning tree that changed Ethernet from being a single link into fairly large networks. I did routing protocols that enable a network to self-configure and be really robust. Early routing protocols were very, very fragile, and I made them much easier to manage and robust and scalable. The particular blockchain stuff really came out of one of the chapters of my book, which I have two textbooks. One's on layers 2 and 3 of networking, and the other is on network security and cryptography, and I do have co-authors on that. So when I was doing a chapter for the third edition, which is not yet out, and is still probably a couple of years away, I was researching electronic money and really, at that point, analyzed what blockchain really is. Let's see, and currently I am a fellow at Dell EMC.
Interesting. So, we're going to have an interesting conversation today for listeners because everyone's so rah-rah blockchain and thinks that, the whole world's going to change and blockchain's going to take over the world. And maybe it is. But we're going to talk about the other side of blockchain, that it has its limitations for sure. It's not a panacea for all the world's issues. So that's what I want to discuss with you today because of your background. And I think you'll bring a really interesting perspective to it.
Okay. Yes, I agree. The hype is astonishing. It's not a well-defined term at all. It's just sort of a buzzword that either people enthusiastically just sort of repeat what they're hearing, or they feel sort of traumatized because they don't exactly know what blockchain is. And then people say, oh, well, it's distributed ledger technology. And then again, they're not exactly sure what does distributed mean, what is a ledger. And with the hype, which are literally things like it is the most important contribution to computing since the invention of the Internet. And also, there are all sorts of articles about how it's going to be applied to change our lives in terms of health care and even securing our nuclear arsenal. So I would like to concentrate instead on what exactly is it, because that is something that's hard to get any information about.
Yeah, if you would define it as you see it, and then we'll talk about, what are the misconceptions people have about its definition and uses and all that. But tell me what is blockchain to you, and how is that different from what you're hearing people parrot out there about?
Right. Well, it's very hard to define a buzzword, which is a moving target. People sort of want to believe that the word is whatever they want it to believe now or in the future. So it's just this umbrella term that when applied sufficiently generally, it means any combination of computers, networking, crypto, and storage, which with that definition, I've been doing blockchain my entire life, as have most of us. So I like to start with where the term started, which was in Bitcoin. Bitcoin, the technology that powers Bitcoin. And so by analyzing and describing that, then we can talk about what the variants are. So Bitcoin, the concept was, the goal of the concept was, let's not trust any big organizations like banks or governments. So there will be no trusted entities whose identities are known. And with that assumption, it led to a design which really is very, very different than anything, I had ever seen before. So trust is given to kind of a community of anonymous miners where anyone can be a miner. You can just download the software, or you could buy a special mining rig that can do it so much faster than that software doesn't really have a chance. So the concept, why is it called blockchain? Well, the format of the data is a chain of blocks where the algorithms are structured such that the community of miners will add another block to the chain about every 10 minutes. Now, what a block is it's transactions that have not yet been recorded that are valid, and the block has a hash that's extremely difficult to compute. And it has to be extremely difficult to compute, or else that's the only security assumption, is that the hash is so difficult to compute that nobody except for the community of miners can manage to put together more compute power than the community of miners has. So, sort of the assumption is they've cornered the world market on compute. Now, how can you adjust how difficult it is to have a hash? Well, if you look at sort of cryptographic hash technology, it's almost like a random number, where if you give it an input, it looks like you just flipped a bunch of coins to get a random hash for that input. So the probability with a particular random input that the output will have the top bit be 0 is a half. The probability that the top 10 bits will be 0 is 1 and 2 to the 10th. So if they want the community to come out with a hash every 10 minutes, then if it takes too long, they'll make the hash easier by making the number of leading zeros fewer, which means it'll be easier to find one. And if hashes are found more often, then they'll make the hash harder by making the maximum value of the hash smaller. I might have the smaller and larger backwards here. But at any rate, currently the hash has to have 70 leading zeros. That's 2 to the 70th. So in order to find a hash, you take a bunch of transactions, you take a random number, then you hash what you have, and you hope that the top 70 bits are going to be 0. And if they're not, you try a different random number, and you keep trying about 1 and 2 to the 70th times. So if you happen to be the lucky miner that finds a hash first, then you'll be rewarded with a certain number of Bitcoins for finding the hash, plus any transaction fees that people choose to put into their transactions. So this is kind of a very profound thing that people should understand. With traditional cryptography, there are people who are authorized to create an integrity check. And those people have some sort of secret that enables them to very efficiently find a hash. I would find a signature to compute the signature. And mathematically, they make it infeasible to forge a signature if you're not one of the authorized people who are allowed to create it. So this is traditionally with public key technology, where the authorized guys have private keys that nobody knows, but public keys that enable them to verify a signature. And with good cryptography, not only is there an enormous gap between the compute needed to create a signature and the compute needed to forge a signature, but by making the key longer, you can make the gap between the authorized guys and the forgers even bigger. So to put that into perspective, with RSA, to do with a 1,000-bit RSA key, it takes about a millisecond on a standard CPU in order to create a signature, and it would take the entire compute capacity of the current Bitcoin mining community about an hour in order to break it and be able to forge one. But if you made the key twice as long, like a 2,000-bit RSA key, it would only take 6 milliseconds to create a signature. That's 6 times longer. But it would take the entire Bitcoin mining community 1 million years to break it. So that.
So what's the current implication of that? Is Bitcoin's, let's talk about Bitcoin specifically. Is the Bitcoin blockchains or protocol security too weak right now in your eyes? What's the bottom line of what you're saying?
It's both too weak and too inefficient. To have to live with a signature that is equally difficult to compute as to forge is, I think, sort of a very big hurdle in this technology, that it would be so much better done with traditional cryptography, where there are authorized known entities with secrets, so that you can make it extremely efficient to create it if you're authorized to, and absolutely mind-bogglingly impossible to forge.
Okay. So how much of a danger do you think there is right now? You know, they talk about 51% attacks, and, you know, the current total hash rate, as I understand it, the Bitcoin network is like almost 3 exahashes. I don't know what that's I don't remember. But how dangerous or insecure, in your opinion, is the current Bitcoin protocol?
Well, certainly any nation state, if they wanted to, could put together enough compute capacity to cripple it. But there's also kind of a weird thing that the assumption is that Bitcoin is extremely democratic. There's nobody in charge. It's just the wisdom and the good intentions of the mining community. But every so often, something happens that requires somebody to make a decision. So in the case of Bitcoin, there was some sort of incompatibility in software, such that 2 different versions did not recognize each other's blocks as valid. And so then a decision had to be made, because that caused the blockchain to fork into 2 forks, one that looked valid to one set of guys and one that looked valid to the other set of guys. Actually, it was one looked invalid to one. The other one was valid, but the guys in that fork were ahead of it computationally. But at any rate, somebody made a decision that they should roll back the ledger to before the fork happened, and to have everybody agree on running one of the versions. So when you make a decision like that, it means that anyone who has mined Bitcoins in the fork that was chosen by whoever to lose, they lose their money, and any transactions that were in there are no longer in the ledger. So if you were the payer in one of those, you're actually kind of free to respend.
The double spend problem, okay.
Yeah.
How long, with the current network as it is, if a fork develops, how long do you think it'll be before the network knows, the nodes know, and how do you think Bitcoin network will react to it, and what can they do to stop a fork, or are they just doomed at that point and that's it?
Well, there's no absolute number as to when a fork will resolve. There's always temporary forks because information doesn't propagate around the internet instantaneously. The way information propagates is through what I call a gossip network, where each of the nodes is configured with the addresses of some set of other nodes. So to have something propagate, assuming there's lots and lots of loops, this will be very expensive, as sort of exponentially many copies of the thing is spawned as things loop around. But no one will send it twice, so at least it's not, sorry about the exponential, it's more like n squared. But if there are certain key nodes in the middle of this gossip network that happen to be down, the gossip network could be partitioned because the only path between A and B might be through C. And if C were down, then there might be an entire partition, in which case this partition could last arbitrarily long, days, weeks, until somebody notices and configures more connectivity or brings up the nodes that are down. There was another...
So what would be so a nation state could, produce denial of service attack on certain nodes or certain clusters, and then simultaneously, I don't know what you'd call it, but, fake transactions or attack the network. I guess it would be a multi-pronged attack, but it sounds like a multi-pronged attack is doable, very doable, especially by a nation state with their capability, and it would fork the network and cause problems for quite a long time, possibly.
Right. So certainly an easy attack would be if some set of miners had more than half of the compute power and they decided that they wanted to discriminate against certain transactions. So they just refused to ever record those. That would be an easy thing to do. Or you could buy a house, with an awful lot of money, and then get together with a bunch of, in this evil community and back up the ledger to before you bought the house, so that that transaction is no longer recorded, and you could respend the money some other way.
Okay. We can go into various attack vectors. I don't know if we should continue in that vein, or probably it sounds like you'd rather talk more about blockchain in general and, again, the misconceptions around it and the weaknesses of it. Or
Right.
Would you rather stick with Bitcoin protocol and, attack vectors? What do you think would be more instructive for listeners?
Well, let's also start with how expensive it is to be doing all of this hashing. So the estimate, it's very hard to know how much electricity is being used, but it seems by computing an estimate with different assumptions and all that, all the estimates I've seen come out to be about the same, which is that it's about equal to a nuclear power plant. The other thing about this technology is that it requires the complete history to be kept in full at lots and lots of nodes. Now, there's a few reasons why it has to be the complete history, as opposed to something like a database where you have different accounts and you could show the balances in all the accounts and you just update that particular thing. Here is something where you need to see every Bitcoin that was ever spent in the history. And so currently the database is about 100 gigabytes, and it's stored in tens of thousands of places. So, that's kind of a serious issue. Another reason you need to have all of the history is that if you are paid something, so a transaction looks like public key A pays public key B a certain amount because of some transaction in the history with a certain hash, then B, in order to make sure that he's validly going to be paid, has to go through the ledger to find the transaction in which A was actually paid that amount. And then he has to go through every transaction since then to make sure that A hasn't spent that money with somebody else.
Yeah, the network, is supposed to do that. And, I guess the 10-minute limit right now seems to be enough. I know there's scaling issues, but for now, it seems like if you don't have a light node, but you have a full one, it can check the 100 gigabytes, as you say, of data pretty rapidly, right?
I guess so. But this is why the transaction has to be kept in its entirety, at least at the full nodes. So if light, as you said,
here would be a good thing. Based on your experience and your knowledge, what are some suggestions you have? You've already given one. Increase the number of digits in the key to upgrade the security. What are maybe 3 or 4 ideas that you have with your vast knowledge base on how to improve, for instance, the Bitcoin protocol to make it just more usable, maybe faster or safer, et cetera?
Well, with the assumption that you want no known entities involved, it sort of leads to that design. So there may or may not be a use case for a currency that that nobody controls. It sounds good. I think the killer app for it is paying ransomware. A large company, for instance, or even an individual who's a citizen of a country still has to obey those laws. So if the government insists that you pay taxes when you sell something, you still have to pay taxes even though you're using Bitcoin, and it might make it harder for there to be a money trail. You're still legally obligated to do that. And certainly a big company that's not allowed to send money to across certain borders and so forth, even if Bitcoin kind of lets them get away with it for now, they're still breaking the law and can be prosecuted, and it probably wouldn't be that hard to trace a money trail to do that. So, that sort of explains sort of the fundamental reason why the design is the way that it is for Bitcoin. But for most other applications that people are talking about, a much more sensible design would be to have known organizations at the center of it that do have public keys and can sign things with private keys, in which case you can make it just trivially efficient and, mind-bogglingly more infeasible for anyone to forge things. Another reason to have sort of known entities in the middle is consider something like eBay, or Amazon. Yes, you can reach, zillions of previously unknown merchants, and you can pay them money. But by having this big organization in the middle, they can mediate disputes. So, for instance, with Bitcoin, suppose I paid you money, but you never shipped the merchandise. Who do I complain to? Whereas with Amazon, for electronic commerce, it seems much more applicable to the technology to have some sort of adult supervision, some sort of well-known entity that can be held accountable and that you can go to for mediating disputes.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, escrow maybe is a possible solution, but you're right. I mean, it's those kind of transactions, right? They require trusted third parties. If you want escrow, if you want, to be able to take action if someone doesn't pay you or doesn't send you items, that kind of thing. That's true. That's definitely true.
So then we get to, quote, private blockchains, unquote. So what I was talking about was sort of Bitcoin, where the assumption is that there'll be tens of thousands of anonymous entities that are all going to somehow agree on what the history is, which led to that particular design.
Right.
If you go to what a private blockchain is, where one company does blockchain as a service, then why is it being called blockchain? They might have multiple nodes, but they're all managed by the same organization. So you could have a far more simpler design. So what I tend to tell people when they're trying to think of solutions is that first you should figure out what the problem is that you're solving. What are the assumptions that you're making? What are your goals? And then look at various technologies. You shouldn't just be so enthusiastic about one thing that you say, can we apply this to problem A? Can we apply it to problem B? And then just sort of modify it in all sorts of ways that, who knows what you will wind up with afterwards. But unless you carefully consider various options and design a solution specifically for the problem you're solving, I suspect you won't actually have the optimal solution.
That makes sense. So what do you think is going to happen with, let's talk about Bitcoin again. Do you think it's going to scale to the point where it becomes used everywhere? Do you think you'll be able to go to your coffee shop and pay for your latte in Bitcoin and, millions of people will use it and it'll take over fiat currency? Or what do you think is going to happen with it? And what, will it just be crushed at some point? What's your opinion?
Well, it's sort of a cute thing, a cute, trendy thing to try. But why would I, as an individual, want to use it rather than a credit card or cash? And I really don't know. It's certainly a lot less safe. I do not keep all of my money in a mattress at home because I assume that banks are better able to protect my money than I am. If I decide to use Bitcoin, then I will have some data on my smartphone, let's say, that will be the equivalent of cash. If I lose that information without having backed it up properly, the money is just plain gone. If somebody breaks into my smartphone and steals the information, then they can spend the money before I do, and they can steal the money. So, what incentive might there be? Now, one incentive is that people say, well, the greedy banks take 3% transaction fees on all the credit card purchases. And and currently, if you look at the transaction fees, which are voluntary in Bitcoin, most transactions don't have any transaction fee, and yet they do get put into the ledger. But the assumption on one of the design things that from the very beginning, for some reason, was that there should be a finite amount of Bitcoins that ever get generated. So when it started, a miner that got that found a block with the right hash would get 50 Bitcoins. And then about 4 years later, it halved to 25. And then 4 years later, it got halved again. So currently it's 12 and a half. So soon, the amount of reward for the miner is going to be negligibly small, and they'll have to make up all of their money with transaction fees. Now, if you look at the amount that they're getting paid right now, it's about $8 per transaction if you take the block reward and the transaction fees. So ultimately, they're still going to be using the same amount of electricity, and electricity barely covers what the reward is. So the transaction fee per transaction will have to average $8. So that's going to wind up being a lot more than the 3% off the top that banks charge for most transactions.
That's true. Yeah, I only focused on the Bitcoin reward, and I thought, okay, well, if it goes down and keeps having the the price of Bitcoin must go up, so that's a good positive pressure on it. But you're right, the transaction fees, they can obviously be a percent of the transaction. So if the price of Bitcoin rises, the percentage will mean more money to the to the miners. But if you look at it in terms of fiat versus Bitcoin, as they diverge, as Bitcoin gets more and more valuable, so the price goes higher and higher. Even if a transaction is 0.5%, but that represents $30, it's going to be a lot for people. So I see what you're saying. Yeah, there could be a rule put in place that would require a block to be filled, or at least a certain percentage of it to be filled, as the block size scales, for instance. But you're right, you may run into that limit of electricity per transaction. I mean, things are getting more efficient. They have ASICs now instead of CPUs, GPUs, FPGAs doing it. There's ASIC boost, which is a new thing that may help. But you're right, as more people, it'll be interesting to see how all these things play out. But
right, so an interesting rule of saying that the block must be filled. Well, what happens at 3 o'clock at night when there's sort of like a lull in transactions? Do you then make it, so that it takes hours before the block is filled? The block has to be able to have enough capacity so that when during the most active time, all the transactions will fit. And so if there's a big gap, like a factor of 10 between really active times and times when it isn't active, then the gap between transactions, between blocks, would have to be 10 times bigger during the quiet times.
Well, that's funny. Right now, things are slowed down because the network can't handle transactions fast enough. As usage grows and as more and more transactions, I don't know what the numbers are, but I think it's 1 or 2 per second. And I don't know what the credit card companies process. I forget, but let's say it's 10,000 a second or 100,000 a second. If the Bitcoin transaction velocity grows to, 10,000 a second and it's able to handle it, even lulls, maybe the block size decreases at night, but there's still enough transactions to make it worthwhile. I mean, again, I guess there's a lot of things to consider, and it sounds like maybe people aren't considering them. It sounds like all the things you're saying, maybe they are being considered. I don't know. But I like that you have this interesting perspective I haven't heard on things that need to be thought out, that we may, where we may run into problems.
Yes, whenever I sort of get, drowned in hype and ill-defined buzzwords, that's when I start saying, hey, wait a minute, let's think about this. So I'm not saying that I have the absolute truth by any means, but these are questions that people should raise. They shouldn't just accept something as truth because they hear it so often.
So are you really passionate about this stuff? I mean, how come you don't want to make your voice a big one in the blockchain community, if you want to call it that? Are you just busy with your own work and this is like a curiosity to you, or do you feel passionate about it and do you want to speak to the community?
Well, I'm certainly passionate about education and getting people to think critically. This particular topic is not something that I particularly felt like I want to do research in, unless what you're saying is, yes, I care about protocols and security and authentication and manageability and usability and all of these sorts of things. And I would certainly consider blockchain, whatever it is, as one of the possible solutions. I wouldn't just say, that it has no use, but I definitely don't exactly know what it is anymore if it, changes very much. So an example is that people are saying, well, what's really great is you have a ledger that cannot ever be changed.
Right, immutable, yeah.
Right, okay, so that sounds good, but anything can be changed. It's just that the integrity check means that if anyone changes it, you'll be able to detect that it was changed. So in that case, I would prefer something like a digital signature where it's so much more efficient to compute and absolutely infeasible to forge. But there's an interesting technology that we've kind of lost. In the old days, we did backups on mag tapes, and they were stored off the network, and no one could touch them. And if everything just went completely bananas, you could go retrieve your mag tape and start where you were from when the backup occurred.
Right.
These days, we tend to, like in public clouds, all of the data is live, including the backups. So if there were some sort of malicious system administrator, they could delete all the copies. Or if your own software, if you're a customer, your own software went crazy and started corrupting your data, all of your copies of the data would also be corrupted. So there are backup technologies that store your data someplace else in a different cloud with different authorized parties. But people have to have the discipline to understand this concept that, even a digital signature is not going to help you. You can, if you don't have this totally independent kind of backup mechanism, because the most you'll be able to do is say, yep, that data is bad. I don't believe that blockchain sort of guarantees that the data will be there, except for this notion that, well, if you keep 10,000 copies of it across the net, then, then if it's corrupted, if someone tries to corrupt some of them by creating an alternate ledger, somebody will have stored the previous version. But then do you want all data to have 10,000 copies? Public clouds tend to keep 6 copies. What is the right number of copies? So what I would implore the world to think about is having some means to have extremely independent backups controlled by different organizations that cannot be, that are not authorized to be modified, that backup services that guarantee that they're never going to modify or delete at least for some amount of time, the information that you have backed up.
Interesting. The cool thing is I could ask you about, dozens of more things because you have so much knowledge, which is great. And I love your perspective. In the interest of time, would it be okay if I ask you about one more element of this? And I want to talk about anonymous versus pseudonymous versus truly versus known versus 100% transparent. And I wanted to ask you about the Bitcoin protocol and maybe some other altcoins like Monero or Zcash and zero knowledge proofs and ring signatures and, just your opinion on, can any of these currencies survive? Can they be truly anonymous, or are they more transparent than everyone would think, and maybe even, ironically, more transparent than our current fiat system?
Well, yeah, anonymity, it's not really anonymous. There's so much information that can be mined from looking at the ledger. And that actually is one of the ways that people can estimate how much money is paid in ransomware by looking at the ledger. So you can change your public key on every single transaction, but there are certainly ways of figuring out, in a lot of cases, who somebody is. So if there's you're paying your mortgage every month. Even if you change your public key each time, the amount and whatever will be pretty clear. When A pays B, pays C, pays D, again, with data mining and sort of clever heuristics, you can get an awful lot of information from all of that. Now, a technology that really would have guaranteed anonymity was an extremely different from this thing that was invented by Chaum, and it was called eCash, which had a bank that was at the center of it, where you could pay it a certain amount of money, and it would give you a certain amount of this electronic cash that it had no idea which coins went with which person. It was sort of cryptographically guaranteed that there was no way that the bank could tell which coins it gave to which people. I mean, through super slick, adorable cryptography. And then you could spend the coins, and then whoever received the coins would then have to go to the bank and deposit it, but they wouldn't have to divulge where they got the coins from. And then they could take out new coins that were anonymous. So that gives you some amount of anonymity.
Is that like coin mixing that they have today?
I'm not sure what you mean by coin mixing, but I suspect not. The actual technology, there is this thing called blind signatures, where I can ask you to sign something for me, but I can encrypt it so that you don't know what you're signing. So the way that it actually worked is that if I withdrew some, a coin's worth of money from your bank, I would then create a coin myself with a random serial number that hopefully didn't conflict with anyone else's, because it would be like a huge random number. And then I would encrypt this and ask you to sign it. So given that it's encrypted, you would have no idea what it is that you're signing, but you would also only be willing to sign one thing for me because I had only withdrawn one coin worth from my account. So now I decrypt it through magic cryptography. And so I now have a coin, which is something with a serial number I created, signed by the bank's public key, and the bank has no idea which serial number I chose. And then when I pay somebody, they can see that the coin is valid because they see the bank signature. They don't actually know it's valid until they go to the bank to make sure that they are the first person to receive that serial number, because otherwise I could spend it 1 billion times. So the first guy who registers the spent coin with the bank records that serial number, and then that serial number can't be used again. So that gave, I think, a much more stronger anonymity guarantee than the Bitcoin thing does, even though Bitcoin doesn't have any identities. It just has public keys.
Interesting. Okay. Last question, because I know, we've gone pretty long, but again, I love talking to you. It's great. There's so much good stuff. Do you think Bitcoin can survive? It can only survive by becoming a lot closer or a lot more regulated, or, closer to how fiat is. Again, more regulated, more transparent. Is it going to have to morph into something that a lot of, let's say, libertarians and privacy advocates don't want in order to survive? What do you think it needs to happen for it to scale and grow? Or do you think it just won't?
Well, I think if you take out the basic tenets of it, it becomes so different that is it really the same thing? So you could say, well, let's say we want to have actual banks in there, and we want to, at that point you could say, let's back up to what we had 5 years ago, or what we have with traditional banking, and that will allow blockchain to survive. It's no longer blockchain. So I think it will. These things will continue on. for the purposes that they're doing. And as a matter of fact, the advice that companies are given is that you should hoard some amount of Bitcoin, so in case you ever have a ransomware attack, you'll be able to pay, because it's not that easy necessarily to gather enough Bitcoin all at once. So I think it'll still be kind of fun to use. But what I find a little frightening is the notion that it's going to be a panacea for all sorts of applications. Most applications do want to have known entities at the heart. And if you're going to do that, then I think there's far more efficient and secure technologies.
Okay. Well, great. So, Radia, I mean, thank you so much. Again, people may say, you're a naysayer and all that, but it's important to have perspectives on both sides and not just hear the cheering, hear hey, there's things we got to look at if we want Bitcoin to work possibly. So, and other, cryptocurrencies and Ethereum, smart contracts, et cetera. We didn't even get into that, but I know there's lots of issues. So thanks again for being on the podcast. Any last thing I should have asked you that I left out that you want to talk about? Or do you feel like we covered a lot of good stuff?
I think we covered a lot of stuff.
Okay. Well, I just want to thank you for being on the podcast, and that's it. Thanks so much for coming.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
You have been listening to Almost Here, Around the Corner Future Technology podcast with Richard Jacobs. Subscribe to this podcast, post a review to discover more future technologies that are poised to transform our lives for better or worse, such as Bitcoin, artificial intelligence, 3D printing, blockchain, virtual reality, and more.